Chapter 24. The Bandalore. Daisy was about to turn 8 years old, so she decided to invite Bert Beamish to tea. A thick wall of ice seemed to have grown up between Daisy and Bert since his father had died. He was always with Roderick Roach, who was very proud to have the son of an Ickabog victim as a friend. But Daisy's coming birthday, which was 3 days before Bert's, would be a chance to find out whether they could repair their friendship. So she asked her father to write a note to Mrs. Beamish, inviting her and her son to tea. To Daisy's delight, a note came back accepting the invitation, and even though Bert still didn't talk to her at school, she held out hope that everything would be made right on her birthday. Although he was well paid, as carpenter to the king, even Mr. Dovetail had felt the pinch of paying the Ickabog tax. So he and Daisy had bought fewer pastries than usual, and Mr. Dovetail stopped buying wine. However, in honor of Daisy's birthday, Mr. Dovetail brought out his last bottle of Jeroboam wine, and Daisy collected all her savings and bought 2 expensive Hopes of Heaven for herself and Bert because she knew they were his favorites. The birthday tea didn't start well. Firstly, Mr. Dovetail proposed a toast to Major Beamish, which made Mrs. Beamish cry. Then the 4 of them sat down to eat, but nobody seemed able to think of anything to say until Bert remembered that he bought Daisy a present. Bert had seen a bandalore, which is what people called yo-yos at that time, in a toy shop window, and bought it with all his saved pocket money. Daisy had never seen one before, and what with Bert teaching her to use it, and Daisy swiftly becoming better at it than Bert was, and Mrs. Beamish and Mr. Dovetail drinking Jeroboam sparkling wine, conversation began to flow much more easily. The truth was that Bert had missed Daisy very much, but hadn't known how to make up with her, with Roderick Roach always watching. Soon, though, it felt as though the fight in the courtyard had never happened, and Daisy and Bert were snorting with laughter about their teacher's habit of digging for bogies in his nose when he thought none of the children were looking. The painful subjects of dead parents, or fights that got out of hand, or King Fred the Fearless, were all forgotten. The children were wiser than the adults. Mr. Dovetail hadn't tasted wine in a long time, and unlike his daughter, he didn't stop to consider that discussing the monster that was supposed to have killed Major Beamish might be a bad idea. Daisy only realized what her father was doing when he raised his voice over the children's laughter. "All I'm saying, Bertha," Mr. Dovetail was almost shouting, "is where's the proof? I like to see proof, that's all." "You don't consider it proof, then, that my husband was killed?" said Mrs. Beamish, whose kindly face suddenly looked dangerous. "Or poor little Nobby Buttons?" "Little Nobby Buttons," repeated Mr. Dovetail. "Little Nobby Buttons. Now you come to mention it, I'd like proof of little Nobby Buttons. Who was he? Where did he live? Where's that old widowed mother gone, who wore that ginger wig? Have you ever met a Buttons family in the city within the city? And if you press me," said Mr. Dovetail, brandishing his wine glass, "if you press me, Bertha, I'll ask you this. Why was Nobby Button's coffin so heavy when all that was left of him were his shoes and a shin bone?" Daisy made a furious face to try and shut her father up, but he didn't notice. Taking another large gulp of wine, he said, "It doesn't add up, Bertha. Doesn't add up. Who's to say, and this is just an idea, mind you, who's to say poor Beamish didn't fall off his horse and break his neck, and Lord Spittleworth saw an opportunity to pretend the Ickabog killed him and charge us all a lot of gold?" Mrs. Beamish rose slowly to her feet. She wasn't a tall woman, but in her anger she seemed to tower awfully over Mr. Dovetail. "My husband," she whispered in a voice so cold that Daisy felt goosebumps, "was the best horseman in all of Cornucopia. My husband would no sooner have fallen off his horse than you'd chop off your leg with an axe, Dan Dovetail. Nothing short of a terrible monster could have killed my husband, and you ought to watch your tongue, because saying the Ickabog isn't real happens to be treason."
"Treason!" jeered Mr. Dovetail. "Come off it, Bertha. You're not going to stand there and tell me you believe in this treason nonsense. Why, a few months ago, not believing in the Ickabog made you a sane man, not a traitor."
"That was before we knew the Ichabod was real," screeched Mrs. Beamish. "Bert, we're going home." "No, no, please don't go," Daisy cried. She picked up a little box she'd stowed under her chair and ran out into the garden after the Beamishes. "Bert, please, look. I got us hopes of heaven. I spent all my pocket money on them." Daisy wasn't to know that when he saw hopes of heaven now, Bert was instantly reminded of the day he'd found out his father was dead. The very last hope of heaven he'd ever eaten had been in the king's kitchen, when his mother was promising him they'd have heard if anything had happened to Major Beamish. All the same, Bert didn't mean to dash Daisy's to the ground. He meant only to push it away. Unluckily, Daisy lost her grip on the box, and the costly pastries fell into the flower bed and were covered in earth. By Petra, age 9. Daisy burst into tears. "Well, if all you care about is pastries," shouted Bert, and he opened the garden gate and led his mother away. Chapter 25. Lord Spittleworth's Problem. Unfortunately for Lord Spittleworth, Mr. Dovetail wasn't the only person who started voicing doubts about the Ickabog. Cornucopia was growing slowly poorer. Rich merchants had no problem paying their Ickabog taxes. They gave the collectors 2 ducats a month, then increased the prices on their pastries, cheeses, hams, and wines to pay themselves back. However, 2 gold ducats a month was increasingly hard to find for the poorer folk, especially with food at the markets more expensive. Meanwhile, up in the marshlands, children began to grow hollow-cheeked. Spittleworth, who had spies in every city and village, began hearing word that people wanted to know what their gold was being spent on, and even demand proof that the monster was still a danger. Now, people said of the cities of Cornucopia that their inhabitants had different natures. Jeroboomers were supposed to be brawlers and dreamers, the Kurdsburgers peaceful and courteous, while the citizens of Chauville were often said to be proud, even snooty. But the people of Barronstown were said to be plain speakers and honest dealers, and it was here that the first serious outbreak of disbelief in the Ickabog happened. A butcher called Tubby Tenderloin called a meeting in the town hall. Tubby was careful not to say he didn't believe in the Ichabod, but he invited everyone at the meeting to sign a petition to the king asking for evidence that the Ichabod tax was still necessary. As soon as this meeting was over, Spittleworth's spy, who had of course attended the meeting, jumped on his horse and rode south, arriving at the palace at midnight. Woken by a footman, Spittleworth hurriedly summoned Lord Flapoon and Major Roach from their beds, and the two men joined Spittleworth in his bedroom to hear what the spy had to say. The spy told the story of the treasonous meeting, then unfurled a map on which he'd helpfully circled the houses of the ringleaders, including that of
tubby tenderloin.
Excellent work, growled Roach. We'll have all of them arrested for treason and slung in jail. Simple.
It isn't simple at all, said Spittleworth impatiently. There were 200 people at this meeting, and we can't lock up 200 people. We haven't got room, for one thing, and for another, everyone will just say it proves we can't show the Ickabog's real.
Then we'll shoot 'em, said Flapoon, and wrap 'em up like we did Beamish, and leave 'em up by the marsh to be found, and people will think the Ickabog got 'em.
Is that Ickabog supposed to have a gun now? Snapped Spittleworth. And 200 cloaks in which to wrap victims?
Well, if you're going to sneer at our plans, my lord, said Roach, why don't you come up with something clever yourself?
That was exactly what Spittleworth couldn't do. Cudgel his sneaky brains though he might, he couldn't think of any way to frighten the cornucopians back into paying their taxes without complaint. What he needed was proof that the Ickabog really existed. But where was he to get it? Pacing alone in front of his fire, after the others had gone back to bed, Spittleworth heard another tap on his bedroom door. What now? He snapped. Into the room slid the footman, Kinkerby. What do you want? Out with it quickly. I'm busy, said Spittleworth.
If it pleases your lordship,
said Kinkerby.
I happened to be passing your room earlier, and I couldn't help hearing about that there treasonous meeting in Baronstown what you, Lord Flapoon, and Major Roach was talking about.
Oh, couldn't you help? Said Spittleworth in a dangerous voice.
I thought I should tell you, my lord. I've got evidence that there's a man here in the city, within the city, what thinks the same way as those traitors in Baronstown,
said Kinkerby.
He wants proof, just like them butchers do. Sounded like treason to me when I heard about it.
Well, of course it's treason, said Spittleworth. Who dares say such things in the very shadow of the palace? Which of the king's servants dares questions the king's word?
Well, as to that,
said Kinkerby, shuffling his feet.
Some would say that's valuable information. Some would.
You tell me who it is, snarled Spittleworth, seizing the footman by the front of his jacket, and then I'll see whether you deserve payment. Their name. Give me their name.
It's Dan Dovetail,
said the footman. Dovetail. Dovetail. I know that name, said Spittleworth, releasing the footman, who staggered sideways and fell into an end table. Wasn't there a seamstress?
His wife, sir. She died,
said Kinkerby, straightening up. Yes, said Spittleworth slowly. He lives in that house by the graveyard, where they never fly a flag and without a single portrait of the king in the windows. How do you know he's expressed these treasonous views?
I happened to overhear Mrs. Beamish telling the scullery maid what he said,
said Kinkerby. You happen to hear a lot of things, don't you, Kinkerby? Commented Spittleworth, feeling in his waistcoat for some gold. Very well, here are 10 tickets for you.
Thank you very much, my lord,
said the footman, bowing low. Wait, said Spittleworth, as Kinkerby turned to go. What does he do, this Dovetail? What Spittleworth really wanted to know was whether the king would miss Mr. Dovetail if he disappeared.
Dovetail, my lord? He's a carpenter,
said Kinkerby, and he bowed himself out of the room. A carpenter, repeated Spittleworth out loud. A carpenter. And as the door closed on Kinkerby,
Another of Spittleworth's lightning-strike ideas hit him, and so amazed was he at his own brilliance, he had to clutch the back of the sofa, because he felt he might topple over. Chapter 26. A Job for Mr. Dovetail. Daisy had gone to school, and Mr. Dovetail was busy in his workshop next morning when Major Roach knocked on the carpenter's door. Mr. Dovetail knew Roach as the man who lived in his old house and who'd replaced Major Beamish as head of the Royal Guard. The carpenter invited Roach inside, but the major declined.
"We've got an urgent job for you at the palace, Dovetail," he said. "A shaft on the king's carriage is broken, and he needs it tomorrow."
"Already?" said Mr. Dovetail. "I only mended that last month."
"It was picked,"
said Major Roach,
"by one of the carriage horses. Will you come?"
"Of course," said Mr. Dovetail, who was hardly likely to turn down a job for the king. So he locked up his workshop and followed Roach through the sunlit streets of the city within the city, talking of this and that, until they reached the part of the royal stables where the carriages were kept. Half a dozen soldiers were loitering outside the door, and they all looked up when they saw Mr. Dovetail and Major Roach approaching. One soldier had an empty flour sack in his hand, and another length of rope. "Good morning," said Mr. Dovetail. He made to walk past them, but before he knew what was happening, one soldier had thrown the flour sack over Mr. Dovetail's head, and two more had pinned his arms behind his back and tied his wrists together with rope. Mr. Dovetail was a strong man. He struggled and fought, but Roach muttered in his ear,
"Make one sound, and it'll be your daughter who pays the price."
Mr. Dovetail closed his mouth. He permitted the soldiers to march him inside the palace, though he couldn't see where he was going. He soon guessed, though, because they took him down two steep flights of stairs and then onto a third, which was made of slippery stone. When he felt a chill on his flesh, he suspected that he was in the dungeons, and he knew it for sure when he heard the turning of an iron key and the clanking of bars. The soldiers threw Mr. Dovetail onto the cold stone floor. Somebody pulled off his hood. The surroundings were almost completely dark, and at first Mr. Dovetail couldn't make out anything around him. Then one of the soldiers lit a torch, and Mr. Dovetail found himself staring at a pair of highly polished boots. He looked up. Standing over him was a smiling Lord Spittleworth. "Good morning, Dovetail," said Spittleworth. "I have a little job for you. If you do it well, you'll be home with your daughter before you know it. Refuse, or do a poor job, and you'll never see her again. We understand each other?" 6 soldiers and Major Roach were lined up against the cell wall, all of them holding swords. "Yes, my lord," said Mr. Dovetail in a low voice. "I understand." "Excellent," said Spittleworth. Moving aside, he revealed an enormous piece of wood, a section of a fallen tree as big as a pony. Beside the wood was a small table bearing a set of carpenter's tools. "I want you to carve me a gigantic foot, Dovetail, a monstrous foot with razor-sharp claws. On top of the foot, I want a long handle so that a man on horseback can press the foot into soft ground to make an imprint. Do you understand your task, carpenter?" Mr. Dovetail and Lord Spittleworth looked deep into each other's eyes. Of course, Mr. Dovetail understood exactly what was going on. He was being told to fake proof of the Ickabog existence. What terrified Mr. Dovetail was that he couldn't imagine why Spittleworth would ever let him go after he'd created the fake monster's foot, in case he'd talked about what he'd done.
You swear, my lord?
said Mr. Dovetail quietly.
Do you swear that if I do this, my daughter won't be harmed, and that I'll be permitted to go home to her?
Of course, Dovetail, said Spittleworth lightly, already moving to the door of the cell. The quicker you complete the task, the sooner you'll see your daughter again.
Now, every night we'll collect these tools from you, and every morning they'll be brought back to you, because we can't have prisoners keeping in the means to dig themselves out, can we? Good luck, Dovetail, and work hard. I look forward to seeing my foot.
And with that, Roach cut the rope binding Mr. Dovetail's wrists and rammed the torch he was carrying into a bracket on the wall. Then Spittleworth, Roach, and the other soldiers left the cell. The iron door closed with a clang, a key turned in the lock, and Mr. Dovetail was left alone with the enormous piece of wood, his chisels, and his knives. Chapter 27. Kidnapped. When Daisy arrived home from school that afternoon, playing with her bandolier as she went, she headed as usual to her father's workshop to tell him about her day. However, to her surprise, she found the workshop locked up. Assuming that Mr. Dovetail had finished work early and was back in the cottage, she walked in through the front door with her school books under her arm. Daisy stopped dead in the doorway, staring around. All the furniture was gone, as were the pictures on the walls, the rug on the floor, the lamps, and even the stove. She opened her mouth to call her father, but in that instant a sack was thrown over her head and a hand clamped over her mouth. Her school books and her bandolier fell with a series of thuds to the floor. Daisy was lifted off her feet, struggling wildly, then carried out of the house and slung into the back of a wagon.
If you make a noise, said a rough voice in her ear, we'll kill your father.
Daisy, drawn breath into her lungs to scream, let it out quietly instead. She felt the wagon lurch and heard the jingling of a harness and trotting hooves as they began to move. By Brianna, age 10. By the turn By the turn that the wagon took, Daisy knew that they were heading out of the city within the city, and by the sounds of market traders and other horses, she realized they were moving out into wider Showville. Though more frightened than she'd ever been in her life, Daisy nevertheless forced herself to concentrate on every turn, every sound, and every smell, so she could get some idea of where she was being taken. After a while, the horses' hooves were no longer falling on cobblestones, but on an earthy track, and the sugar-sweet air of Showville was gone, replaced by the green, loamy smell of the countryside. The man who'd kidnapped Daisy was a large, rough member of the Ickabog Defense Brigade called Private Prod. Spittleworth had told Prod to get rid of the little Dovetail girl, and Prod had understood Spittleworth to mean that he was to kill her. Prod was quite right to think this. Spittleworth had selected Prod for the job of murdering Daisy because Prod was fond of using his fists and seemed not to care whom he hurt. However, as he drove through the countryside, passing woods and forests where he might easily strangle Daisy and bury her body, it slowly dawned on Private Prod that he wasn't going to be able to do it. He happened to have a little niece around Daisy's age, of whom he was very fond. In fact, every time he imagined himself strangling Daisy, he seemed to see his niece Rosie in his mind's eye, pleading for her life. So, instead of turning off the dirt track into the woods, Prod drove the wagon onward, racking his brains as to what to do with Daisy. Inside the flour sack, Daisy smelled the sausages of Baronstown mingling with the cheese fumes of Kurdsburg, and wondered which of the two she was being taken to. Her father had occasionally taken her to buy cheese and meat in these famous cities. She believed that if she could somehow give the driver the slip when he lifted her down from the wagon, she'd be able to make her way back to Chauville in a couple of days. Her frantic mind kept returning to her father, and where he was, and why all the furniture in their house had been removed. But she forced herself to concentrate on the journey the wagon was making instead, to be sure of finding her way home again. However, hard as she listened out for the sound of the horses' hoofs on the stone bridge over the Fluma that connected Baronstown and Kurdsburg, it never came, because instead of entering either city, Private Prod passed them by. He just had a brainwave about what to do with Daisy. So, skirting the city of sausage makers, he drove on north. Slowly, the meat and cheese smells disappeared from the air, and night began to fall. Private Prod had remembered an old woman who lived on the outskirts of Jeroboam, which happened to be his hometown. Everyone called this old woman Ma Grunter. She took in orphans and was paid 1 ducat a month for each child she had living with her. No boy or girl had ever succeeded in running away from Ma Grunter's house, and it was this that made Prod decide to take Daisy there. The last thing he wanted was Daisy finding her way back home to Chauville, because Spittleworth was likely to be furious that Prod hadn't done what he was told. Though so scared, cold, and uncomfortable in the back of the wagon, the rocking had lulled Daisy to sleep, but suddenly she jerked awake again. She could smell something different in the air now, something she didn't much like, and after a while she identified it as wine fumes, which she recognized from the rare occasions when Mr. Dovetail had a drink. They must be approaching Jeroboam, a city she'd never visited. Through the small holes in the sack, she could see daybreak. The wagon was soon jolting over cobblestones again, and after a while it came to a halt. At once, Daisy tried to wriggle out of the back of the wagon onto the ground. But before she hit the street, Private Prod seized her, and he carried her, struggling, to the door of Ma Grunter's, which he pounded with a heavy fist. All right, I'm coming, came a high, cracked voice from inside the house. There came the noise of many bolts and chains being removed, and Ma Grunter was revealed in the doorway, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane, though, of course, Daisy, being still in the sack, couldn't see her. New child for you, Ma, said Prod, carrying the wriggling sack into Ma Grunter's hallway, which smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap wine. Now, you might think Ma Grunter would be alarmed to see a child in a sack carried into her house, but in fact, the kidnapped children of so-called traitors had found their way to her before. She didn't care what a child's story was. All she cared about was the 1 ducat a month the authorities paid her for keeping them. The more children she packed into her tumble-down hovel, the more wine she could afford, which was really all she cared about. So she held out her hand and croaked, 5 ducat payment placement fee, which was what she always asked for if she could tell somebody really wanted to get rid of a child. Prod scowled, handed over 5 ducats, and left without another word. Ma Grunter slammed the door behind him. As he climbed back onto his wagon, Prod heard the rattle of Ma Grunter's chains and the scraping of her locks. Even if it had cost him half his month's pay, Prod was glad to have gotten rid of the problem of Daisy Dovetail. and he drove off as fast as he could back to the capital. Chapter 28. Ma Grunter. Having made sure her front door was secure, Ma Grunter pulled the sack off her new charge. Blinking in the sudden light, Daisy found herself in a narrow, rather dirty hallway, face to face with a very ugly old woman who was dressed all in black, a large brown wart with hairs growing out of it on the tip of her nose. "John!" the old woman croaked, without taking her eyes off Daisy, and a boy much bigger and older than Daisy, with a blunt, scowling face, came shuffling into the hall, cracking his knuckles. "Go and tell Jane upstairs to put another mattress in their room." "Make one of the little brats do it," grunted John. "I haven't had breakfast." Ma Grunter suddenly swung her heavy, silver-handled cane at the boy's head. Daisy expected to hear a horrible thud of silver on bone, but the boy ducked the cane neatly, as though he'd had a lot of practice, cracked his knuckles again, and said sullenly, "All right, all right." He disappeared up some rickety stairs. "What's your name?" said Ma Grunter, turning back to Daisy. "Daisy," said Daisy. "No, it isn't," said Ma Grunter. "Your name is Jane." Daisy would soon find out that Ma Grunter did the same thing to every child who arrived in her house. Every girl was rechristened Jane, and every boy was renamed John. The way the child reacted to be given a new name told Ma Grunter exactly what she needed to know about how hard it was going to be to break that child's spirit. Of course, very tiny children who came to Ma Grunter simply agreed that their name was John or Jane and quickly forgot that they'd been called anything else. Homeless children and lost children who could tell that being John or Jane was the price of having a roof over their heads were also quick to agree to the change. But every so often, Ma Grunter met a child who wouldn't accept their new name without a fight, and she knew, before Daisy even opened her mouth, that the girl was going to be one of them. There was a nasty, proud look about the newcomer, and while skinny, she looked strong, standing there in her coveralls with her fists clenched. "My name," said Daisy, "is Daisy Dovetail. I was named after my mother's favorite flower." "Your mother is dead," said Ma Grunter, because she always told the children in her care that their parents were dead. It was best if the little wretches didn't think there was anybody to run away to. "That's true," said Daisy, her heart hammering very fast. "My mother is dead." "And so is your father," said Ma Grunter. The horrible old woman seemed to swim before Daisy's eyes. She had nothing to eat since the previous lunchtime and had spent a night of terror on Prod's wagon. Nevertheless, she said in a cold, clear voice, "My father's alive. I'm Daisy Dovetail, and my father lives in Showville." "Your name is Jane, and your father is dead." By Kinza, age 9. She had to believe her father was still there. She couldn't let herself doubt it, because if her father was dead, then all light would disappear from the world forever. "No, he isn't," said Ma Grunter, raising her cane. "Your father is as dead as a doornail, and your name is Jane." "My name," began Daisy, but with a sudden whoosh, Ma Grunter's cane came swinging at her head. Daisy ducked as she'd seen the big boy do, but the cane swung back again, and this time it hit Daisy painfully on the ear and knocked her sideways. "Let's try that one again," said Ma Grunter. "Repeat after me. My father is dead."
and my name is Jane.
I won't, shouted Daisy, and before the cane could swing back at her, she'd darted under Ma Grunter's arm and run off into the house, hoping that the back door might not have bolts on it. In the kitchen, she found two skinny, frightened-looking children, a boy and a girl, ladling a dirty green liquid into bowls, and a door with just as many chains and padlocks on it as the other. Daisy turned and ran back to the hall, dodged Ma Grunter and her cane, then sped upstairs, where more thin, pale children were cleaning and making beds with threadbare sheets. Ma Grunter was already climbing the stairs behind her.
Say it,
Croaked Ma Grunter.
say, my father is dead, and my name is Jane.
My father's alive, and my name is Daisy, shouted Daisy, now spotting a hatch in the ceiling that she suspected led to an attic. Snatching a Snatching a feather duster out of the hand of the scared girl, she poked the hatch open. A rope ladder fell, which Daisy climbed, pulling it up after her and slamming the attic door so that Ma Grunter and her cane couldn't reach her. She could hear the old woman cackling below and ordered a boy to stand guard over the hatch to make sure Daisy didn't come out. Later, Daisy would discover that the children gave one another extra names, so they knew which John or Jane they were talking about. The big boy, now standing guard over the attic hatch, was the same one Daisy had seen downstairs. His nickname among the other children was Basher John, for the way he bullied the smaller children. Basher John was by way of being a deputy for Ma Grunter, and now he called up to Daisy, telling her children had died of starvation in that attic, and that she'd find their skeletons if she looked hard enough. The ceiling of Ma Grunter's attic was so low that Daisy had to crouch. It was also very dirty, but there was a small hole in the roof through which a shaft of sunlight fell. Daisy wriggled over to this and put her eye to it. Now she could see the skyline of Terrebonne. Unlike Chauville, where the buildings were mostly sugar white, this was a city of dark gray stone. Two men were reeling along the street below, bellowing a popular drinking song.
I drank a single bottle and the Ickabog's a lie. I drank another bottle and I thought I heard a sigh. And now I've drunk another, I can see it slinking by. The Ickabog is coming, so let's drink before we die.
Daisy sat with her eye pressed against the spy hole for an hour until Ma Grunter came and banged on the hatch with her cane.
What's your name?
Daisy Dovetail, bellowed Daisy. And every hour afterward the question came, and the answer remained the same. However, as the hours wore by, Daisy began to feel lightheaded with hunger. Every time she shouted, Daisy Dovetail, back at Ma Grunter, her voice was weaker. At last, she saw through her spy hole in the attic that it was becoming dark. She was very thirsty now, and she had to face the fact that if she kept refusing to say her name was Jane, there really might be a skeleton in the attic for Basher John to frighten other children with. So the next time Ma Grunter banged on the attic hatch with her cane and asked what Daisy's name was, she answered, Jane.
And is your father alive?
Asked Ma Grunter. Daisy crossed her fingers and said, No.
Very good,
said Ma Grunter, pulling open the hatch so that the rope ladder fell down.
Come down here, Jane.
When Daisy was standing beside her again, the old lady cuffed her around the ear.
That's for being a nasty, lying, filthy little brat. Now go and drink your soup, wash up the bowl, then get to bed.
Daisy gulped down a small bowl of cabbage soup, which was the nastiest everything she'd ever eaten, washed the bowl in the greasy barrel that Ma Grunter kept for doing dishes, and went back upstairs. There was a spare mattress on the floor of the girls' bedroom, so she crept inside while all the other girls watched her and got under the threadbare blanket, fully dressed because the room was very cold. Daisy found herself looking into the kind blue eyes of a girl her own age, with a gaunt face. "You lasted much longer than most," whispered the girl. She had an accent Daisy had never heard before. Later, Daisy would learn that the girl was a Marshlander. "What's your name?" Daisy whispered. "Your real name." The girl considered Daisy with those huge forget-me-not eyes. "We're not allowed to say." "I promise I won't tell," whispered Daisy. The girl stared at her. Just when Daisy thought she wasn't going to answer, the girl whispered, "Martha." "Pleased to meet you, Martha," whispered Daisy. "I'm Daisy Dovetail, and my father's still alive."